The rifle stock was cold against his cheek. He had it raised before the knock came a second time, a soft thudding against the heavy pine door, a sound almost lost in the wind. You don't get visitors in a blizzard, not at this elevation, not 3 years after you've made it clear you're the sort of man who prefers the company of ghosts. He had a ghost. One was enough. This is how a life can shrink to the size of a rifle's sight, a door, a single memory, and how, in the space of a heartbeat, it can be pushed wide open again. You have to watch for the moments that change the angle of the light. This was one of them. He didn't know it yet, but the person on the other side of that door was not an ending. She was a beginning, sent by a man who was already gone. He held his breath, listening. The wind howled, scraping snow against the cabin walls. The world had gone white and loud. A debt can be paid, but a life must be lived. He hadn't thought of that old line, one of K.O.'s, in years. A strange time for it to surface. He lowered the rifle an inch. The knock came a third time, patient, insistent. Not the sound of trouble. Trouble was louder, more sure of itself. This was the sound of someone with nowhere else to go, and he knew, even then, that he was going to open the door. Everything that happened after, the claim, the fight, the quiet mending of 2 broken lives, all of it balanced on that single, simple choice. By the way, wherever in the world you're watching from right now, let me know in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories reach. Okay, where were we? Right, the man at the door, Elias Thorne. For 3 years, his life had followed a severe and simple track. He rose before the sun, broke the ice in the wash basin, and made coffee. He worked until the sun was high, ate standing, then worked until it was gone. He mended fence, cleared rock, checked his traps, and tended the 2 hardy horses in the lean-to. He did the work of 2 men, because there had once been 2 people here. Or 1.5. He was the whole one. Sarah had been the other, and she had only had 9 days in this place before the fever took her. 9 days. He could count them on his fingers, each one a perfect, sun-drenched memory that felt more real than the 3 years of winter that had followed. He had built this cabin for her, with his own hands, from trees he'd felled himself. He'd chinked the logs with mud and moss, planed the floors smooth for her feet, and built the hearth from river stones he'd carried up the mountain one by one. She had stood in the doorway, her hands on her rounding belly, and said, "Elias, it's a fortress." He'd meant it to be. A fortress to keep the world out. But he learned that the worst things don't knock. They're already inside you, waiting. After she was gone, the work was all that was left. The work and the silence. He told himself it was simplification. A man didn't need much. He had his 40 acres, a tight roof, a clear creek, and the towering silence of the mountains. He had come to mistake that silence for peace. He had forgotten the difference between being alone and being lonely. His only contact with the world was a trip to the settlement at Verde Crossing every 2 months for flour, salt, coffee, and cartridges. He'd trade a few pelts with the storekeeper, Mr. Abernathy, nod at the handful of faces who still remembered him, and then ride the long trail back to his fortress. He never lingered. People's pity felt like a weight he couldn't carry. So when the knock came, it was like a stone tossed into a still, frozen pond. It was a sound from another life, the one he'd buried along with his wife. He moved to the door, the rifle held loose in his right hand, its barrel pointed at the floor. He drew the heavy iron bolt, the sound a loud complaint in the quiet cabin. The wind tore at the door, trying to rip it from his grasp. He held it fast, and looked out into the swirling chaos of the storm. And there she was, a woman, alone. She was wrapped in a heavy buffalo robe, her face obscured by the snow clinging to her hair and the fur ruff of the hood. She did not speak. She simply stood there, a small, still figure against the vast, violent white of the storm. He saw no horse, no tracks that hadn't already been erased by the wind. She seemed to have materialized from the snow itself. He saw the exhaustion in the slump of her shoulders, but there was no plea in her eyes. Her gaze was direct, unwavering. She was Apache. He knew the cast of her face, the high cheekbones, the proud set of her jaw. He had scouted with them for years, had known them as friends and as foes. He had known one better than any other man alive. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough from disuse. She reached inside her robe, a slow, deliberate movement. His hand tightened on the rifle out of pure instinct, a reflex honed over years of caution.
But she wasn't reaching for a weapon.
She pulled out a small, rolled piece of smoked hide, tied with a leather thong. She held it out to him. Her fingers were raw with cold. He took it. The hide was stiff, but he could feel the faint warmth of her body still in it. He stepped back, holding the door open for her. She hesitated for only a second before moving past him into the relative warmth of the cabin. She did not look at him. Her eyes swept the room once, taking in the clean-swept floor, the stacked firewood, the single cot, the empty chair by the cold hearth. And then she stood by the door, waiting. She dripped melting snow onto the floorboards he had planed for another woman. He closed the door, shutting out the storm's scream. The silence that fell was heavier than before. He walked to the table and with clumsy fingers untied the leather thong. He unrolled the hide. It was a map, not of any territory he knew from a surveyor's office, but a map of the heart.
It showed a creek,
A stand of sentinel pines, and a single cabin tucked against a red rock mesa. His cabin, his land. And in the corner, burned into the hide with a hot piece of wire, was a symbol, a crescent moon with a single star resting in its curve. The breath went out of him. Only one man used that sign. It was the mark he and K.O. had shared, their private signature on messages left for each other on rocks and trees across 1,000 miles of hard country. It meant safe camp. It meant friend. It meant a trust deeper than blood. But K.O., Cochise's shadow, the man who had been his brother in all but name, was dead. He'd gotten word last spring. A skirmish with Mexican soldiers across the border. He looked from the map to the woman. She had pushed back her hood. Her black hair was streaked with gray at the temples. Her face was a mask of weary endurance, but her eyes held a fierce, unyielding light. She was hurt. He could see it now, the way she favored her left leg, the dark stain spreading slowly on the deerskin wrap just below her knee. She had walked a long way in this storm, wounded, guided by a dead man's drawing. "K.O. sent you," he said. It wasn't a question. She gave a single sharp nod. Her eyes flickered to the empty chair by the fire. It was Sarah's chair. No one had sat in it for 3 years. The woman said nothing, but her meaning was clear. The drawing was a request, a debt. K.O. had saved his life twice, once from a Comanche arrow, once from a desert thirst that had him seeing visions of angels. A debt like that was never truly paid. It was only passed on. He looked at the map, then at the woman, then at the empty chair. A fortress was no good if it couldn't shelter a friend. He laid the map on the table and walked to the hearth. He knelt and began to build a fire. He did not ask her name. He did not ask how she was wounded or what had driven her from her people. The map was all the explanation he needed. K.O. had sent her. That was the beginning and the end of it, for now. He struck a match, and the kindling caught, casting a warm, dancing light on her still, patient face. She watched the flames as if she hadn't seen fire in a very long time. He worked without speaking, his movements economical. He pointed to the chair. "Sit." It came out like a command, harsher than he intended. She looked at the chair, then back at him. She understood its significance, he was sure of it. She was a woman who saw things. After a moment, she gave another slight nod and moved to the chair, lowering herself into it with a carefully controlled wince of pain. Elias fetched a basin of water and a clean cloth from a chest. He knelt before her, not in supplication, but in practicality. He gestured to her leg. She watched his face for a long moment, her dark eyes searching for something he couldn't name. He met her gaze steadily. He was not offering pity. He was offering medicine. There was a difference. Finally, she untied the wrapping. The gash was deep, inflamed, and ugly, clearly made by a piece of sharp rock. It was clean, which meant she had tended to it herself, but it needed stitching. He worked in silence, cleaning the wound with carbolic soap that stung. She made no sound, not even a hiss of breath. Her stillness was absolute, a thing of immense and disciplined power. He had seen hardened soldiers cry out from less. He stitched the wound with a fine needle and gut, his hands surprisingly steady. They were calloused and scarred from work, but they remembered the delicate tasks. When he was done, he wrapped her leg in clean linen. He rose and put the basin aside. The fire was crackling now, throwing heat into the small room. He moved to the stove and began to make coffee, and then spooned stew from a pot into a bowl. He set the bowl and a spoon on a small stool beside her chair. She looked at the food, then at him. He was already at the other side of the room, checking the action on his rifle, giving her the privacy of his back. He heard the faint click of the spoon against the bowl. The first week passed in this way, a rhythm of silence and shared space. He learned her name was Ishkane, which meant she walks alone. He learned it not because she told him, but because he found her tracing the name in the frost on the window pane one morning. He spoke the name aloud, quietly. She turned and looked at him, and for the first time, he saw something other than endurance in her eyes. It might have been surprise. She was a relentless worker. By the third day, though she still limped, she insisted on helping. She took over the mending of his clothes, her stitches small and perfect, far better than his own clumsy work. She repaired a bridle with a skill that was both art and engineering. She would watch him work, and he would feel her eyes on him, assessing. One afternoon, he was splitting wood, his form sloppy with fatigue. She came out of the cabin, took the second axe without a word, and began to work alongside him. Her rhythm was smoother, more efficient. She used the weight of the axe, letting it do the work, while he was still trying to force it. He watched her for a moment, then adjusted his own swing to match hers. He did not feel judged. He felt seen. They ate their meals in silence at the small table. At first, the quiet was a wall between them, thick and guarded. But slowly, it began to change. It became a shared space, a language of its own. He found he didn't need to fill it with words. He would watch her hands as she ate, or the way she looked into the fire, and he felt he was learning more about her than any story could tell him. Her hands were never idle. In the evenings, she would work a piece of leather or sharpen a knife, her focus total. He started to notice the small changes in the cabin,
A bundle of herbs he didn't recognize.
hanging from the rafters to dry, filling the room with a clean, sharp scent. The way she arranged the firewood by size, making it easier to build a fire in the pre-dawn chill. They were small things, adjustments to his rigid routine, but they felt significant. The cabin was no longer just his space, a monument to his grief. It was becoming something else, a shared shelter. One evening, about 2 weeks in, she spoke. He was cleaning his rifle, and she was sitting in Sarah's chair, scraping a hide with a piece of flint. The only sounds were the scrape of the flint and the oiled click of the rifle bolt. "He spoke of you," she said, her voice low and even. "K.O." Elias stopped his work. He looked at her. "What did he say?" "He said you were a man who was careful with things," she said. "He said you knew that a thing mended right is stronger than a thing that never broke." He thought about that. He had always taken pride in his repairs, in making things last. But he knew K.O. had meant more than just tack and tools. He had been talking about people, about lives. He looked at his own life, a thing that had been shattered. He was not mending it. He was just carrying the pieces. "He was a good man," Elias said, the words inadequate. "He was," she said, and that was all. The conversation was over, but it had opened a door, a small one. A few days later, he found her by the creek. The storm had passed, leaving the world buried in a deep, pristine silence. She was kneeling on the bank, her wounded leg stretched out, looking into the water. He came and stood beside her. "I called it Thorn Creek," he said, for no reason he could name. "After my family." She didn't look at him. She pointed a slender finger at the water, where it eddied around a large, moss-covered stone. "Its name," she said, speaking the Apache word for it, "is the water that remembers the way home." He stood there, listening to the sound of the water, and thought that her name for it was better. It was truer. His name was a claim, a mark of ownership. Hers was a description of its soul. He began to understand that there were two maps for this place. The one the surveyors drew, with its lines and numbers, and the one that was written on the land itself, in a language he was only just beginning to learn. Their evenings took on a new ritual. After the meal, he would read. He had only 3 books: the Bible, a worn copy of Shakespeare, and a manual on animal husbandry. He read aloud, not for her, but for himself, to hear the sound of a voice in the quiet. He read slowly, his voice a low rumble. He did not know if she understood the words, but she would listen, her hands busy with some small task, her eyes on the fire. One night, he looked up from his reading and saw that she was watching him, her expression unreadable. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of self-consciousness. "It's just words," he said, closing the book. "They are your words," she said, "your people's songs." He hadn't thought of them that way. He picked up the book again. After that, he found himself choosing the passages more carefully. He read the parts about gardens and seasons, about loyalty and loss. He was not just reading words anymore, he was speaking. He also began to notice the second symbol on the map K.O. had sent. It was smaller, tucked below the crescent moon. It was a drawing of a doorway with a winding path leading to it. He had taken it to mean, "Find this door." But the more he looked at it, the more he felt he was missing something. K.O. never did anything without a second reason, a hidden meaning. The map had led her to his door, yes, but the other symbol, it felt like an instruction, a purpose he had yet to understand. Shelter that becomes home. The phrase surfaced in his mind, and he didn't know where it came from, but it felt right. It was near the end of the first month that Mr. Abernathy, the storekeeper, rode out to see him. It was the first visitor Elias had had in 3 years, and the sight of the man on his mule picking his way up the trail filled him with a cold dread. Abernathy was a good man, but he was not one for social calls. He brought news. Elias met him on the porch. Ishkane remained inside, but he knew she was watching from the window. "Elias," Abernathy said, not dismounting. He was a small, worried-looking man with a kind face. "Thought I should warn you. Man came through town last week, asking about you." "What kind of man?" "Name of Croft, Silas Croft. Works for the Pinhook Mining Syndicate. Says they're buying up all the land along this creek. Says there's a vein of silver up in the high country, and they need the water rights to get it out." Elias felt a knot tighten in his stomach. "This is my land. I have the deed." "He knows," Abernathy said, chewing on his lip. "That's the thing. He says your deed is faulty. Says the original survey was off by 100 yards, and that the creek isn't on your 40 acres at all. Says it's on territorial land, which he has just filed a claim on." It was an old trick, a lie, backed by money and lawyers. The survey marker is a rod of solid iron, driven into the bedrock by the west bank. It's not off by 100 yards. It's not off by an inch. I know it, and you know it, but Croft has the ear of the territorial judge, and he's hired on a couple of hard men to persuade folks. He bought out the Miller place downstream. Miller didn't want to sell, but after his barn burned down one night, he changed his mind. Abernathy looked pointedly at Elias's cabin, then at the barn. "Just be careful, Elias. This Croft, he's not a man who asks twice." Abernathy turned his mule and started back down the trail, leaving Elias standing on the porch with the cold wind biting at him. He was no longer just a man grieving in his fortress. He was a man with something to lose. He turned and went back inside. Ishkane was standing by the hearth. She had his shotgun in her hands. She wasn't pointing it. She was just holding it, checking its weight. She knew. She had heard, or she had simply understood from the way the air had changed. She looked at him. "That man," she said. "He will come here." "Yes," Elias said. "This is good land," she said. "The water is clean." She looked around the small cabin, her gaze lingering on the neatly stacked firewood, the drying herbs, the sturdy walls. "This is a good house." It was the first time she had offered an opinion on his life, on the place he had built. It was a simple statement of fact, but it landed with the weight of a vow. She was not just a guest seeking shelter from a storm. She was a resident. She was standing her ground. And Elias realized, with a clarity that startled him, that he was no longer standing alone. A debt can be paid, he thought, but a life must be lived. And a life had to be defended. Croft came 5 days later. He did not come alone. 2 men flanked him on horseback, hard-faced men with rifles in their saddle scabbards and pistols on their hips. Croft himself was a portly man in a city suit that looked out of place in the high country. He had a soft face, but his eyes were like chips of slate. He rode right up to the cabin and dismounted as if he owned the place. Elias was waiting on the porch. He held his Winchester, but it was pointed at the ground. To his left, Ishkane stood in the open doorway. She held the old, double-barreled shotgun, and unlike him, she held it at the ready, its twin muzzles making 2 dark eyes that stared directly at Croft's chest. She looked smaller than the gun, but she held it with an unnerving stillness. "Thorn," Croft said, not bothering with a greeting. He gestured vaguely at the land around them. "You've been informed of my company's interest in this valley. I'm here to make you a formal offer. $500 for your 40 acres, and you walk away clean." "It's not for sale," Elias said. Croft smiled, a thin, unpleasant expression. "I think you misunderstand. This isn't a negotiation. Your claim is based on a fraudulent survey. The creek and the 30 acres bordering it are not legally yours. I filed a competing claim, and the territorial court will uphold it. The 500 is a gesture of goodwill to save us all the time and trouble of legal proceedings." "There's no fraud," Elias said, his voice level. "The marker is where it's always been. You can check it yourself." "Markers can be moved," Croft said dismissively. "The official map in the capital is what matters, and it shows the line falling on the other side of that ridge. I'm giving you a chance to get something for nothing, Thorn. You should take it." Elias looked at the man's smug face, at the hired muscle sitting silent on their horses. He thought of the 9 days he'd had with Sarah here, the promises he had made to her in this very spot. He thought of the 3 years he had spent turning his grief into this homestead, every fence post a memory, every stone in the hearth a prayer. And he thought of Ishkene, standing beside him, a woman sent by a dead friend who had called this place a good house. "The answer is no," Elias said. "This is my land. You and your men need to leave it." Croft's smile vanished. His eyes hardened. He looked past Elias to Ishkene. "And who is this? Your squaw?" The word was an insult, meant to provoke. Before Elias could react, Ishkene took 1 step forward. She didn't raise the shotgun, but her presence seemed to fill the porch. "I am in my home," she said, her voice quiet, but carrying with deadly force. "You are not welcome." Croft stared at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He had expected a timid woman, not this resolution. He looked back at Elias, then at his 2 men. He was weighing the odds. A fight here and now would be messy. He preferred to let the law, which he owned, do his dirty work. "Have it your way, Thorn," he said, swinging back onto his horse. "You'll be hearing from my lawyer, and from the sheriff. You'll be served with an eviction notice within the month. When we come back, we won't be making offers." He wheeled his horse around and rode away, his men falling in behind him. They didn't look back. Elias stood on the porch, watching them go, the rifle suddenly heavy in his hands. He could feel his heart hammering against his ribs. He had faced down armed men before, but this felt different. This wasn't a fight over a stolen horse or a disputed card game. It was a fight for the ground under his feet, for the very shape of his life. He turned to Ishkene. She was lowering the shotgun, her movements fluid and economical. She broke it open to show the chambers were empty. She had faced them down with an unloaded gun. He stared at her, a new kind of respect dawning in him. She met his gaze, and her expression was calm, as if she did this every day. "He will come back," she said. "I know." That night, the silence in the cabin was different again. It wasn't peaceful or companionable. It was charged, the quiet of a long fuse burning. Elias couldn't settle. He paced the floor, his mind racing. Croft wasn't bluffing. He had the money to bend the law to his will. A piece of paper in a faraway office could undo years of back-breaking work. It could take this place from him. He stopped at the window and looked out at the moonlit snow. He saw 2 sets of tracks leading from the cabin to the woodpile and back again. His and hers. For the first time in 3 years, He was not just fighting for a memory, he was fighting for a life, a shared one. He thought of Ko's map, the crescent moon for safe camp, and the other symbol, the path leading to a doorway, shelter that becomes home. Ko hadn't just sent her here for a season's safety. He was a strategist. He saw the whole board. He had sent her to Elias and Elias to her. He had seen two solitary people who were stronger together. He had sent a partner, an ally, not a burden. The debt he owed Ko wasn't just to give her shelter. The real debt was to understand the gift he had been sent. A chance to stop living in the past, a chance to build something new on the foundations of the old. The law was Croft's weapon, but the law could also be a shield. He thought about deeds, claims, and property rights. A single man's claim was one thing, a family's claim was another. The law, for all its flaws, respected the idea of a homestead, a family putting down roots. He turned from the window. Ishkene was watching him from her chair by the fire. She had been watching him all along, her stillness a silent question. He walked over and stood before her. His heart was beating a slow, heavy rhythm. This was harder than facing Croft. This was a different kind of risk.
The law is a tricky thing,
He began, his voice low. A man alone, his claim can be challenged, disputed. But a husband and wife, a family, their claim is stronger. The law protects the home. He took a breath. Croft thinks I'm alone. He thinks he can push me off this land because there's nobody here but me. He looked at her, trying to find the right words. There were no words for what he was really asking. He could only speak in the plain language of survival. If we were married, he said, the words sounding strange and foreign in the small cabin. If we filed the deed in both our names, Thorn and Ishkene, it would be much harder for him to break the claim. It would be a legal wall he might not be able to climb. He let the words hang in the air between them. It was a proposal of cold, hard practicality, a business arrangement, a strategy. But as he looked at her face, illuminated by the firelight, he knew it was more than that. He was not just offering a plan. He was asking her to tie her life to his, to stand with him not just on the porch with an empty shotgun, but on a piece of paper, in a courthouse, and in all the days that would follow. He was asking her to help him turn this shelter into a home. He was asking her to choose this life freely. She did not answer right away. She looked down at her hands, then into the fire. The flames cast shadows that danced across her still features. He could not read her expression. He had offered her a shield, but it was also a chain. He had no right to ask it of her. She was a free woman. She walks alone. He was asking her to walk with him. He waited, his own silence a testament to the weight of her decision. The fire crackled. The wind whispered at the eaves. He had laid his hope on the table, and he could do nothing now but wait for her to either pick it up or leave it be. Finally, she looked up at him. Her eyes were clear and deep. "It is a good plan," she said. That was all.
2 words in his language,
4 in hers. But they were enough. They were everything. He felt a profound sense of relief wash over him, so strong it almost buckled his knees. It was more than just a victory against Croft. It was a lifeline, a promise that he would not face the coming fight or the coming years by himself. "We'll ride to Verde Crossing at first light," he said. She nodded. "I will be ready." The ride to town was cold, the air sharp and thin. They rode side by side, their horses' breath pluming in the winter sun. They didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. The decision had been made in the quiet of the cabin, and now all that remained was the formal act. When they reached the settlement, Elias led them straight to the small clapboard building that served as the county clerk's office. The clerk, a man named Peters, was a balding, weary man who peered at them over his spectacles. He remembered Elias. He looked from Elias's determined face to Ishkene's proud, impassive one, and a flicker of understanding passed through his eyes. He knew about Silas Croft. He knew about the mining syndicate and their methods. "We need a marriage license," Elias said, his voice steady, "and we need to file an amended deed for my property." Peters did not ask any questions. He simply pulled out the requisite forms and a dusty ledger. He filled out the license, his pen scratching in the quiet office. He asked for their names. "Elias Thorne," Elias said. He looked to Ishkene. She spoke her name, clear and strong. "Ishkene?" Peters paused, pen hovering over the paper. "No family name?" "My name is Ishkene," she repeated, her tone leaving no room for argument. She would not be erased or absorbed. She would be herself. Elias met the clerk's eyes. "Her name is Ishkene," he affirmed. Peters nodded slowly and wrote it down. Ishkene. He then took out the large map of the county and located Elias's plot. With deliberate care, he drew up the new deed, listing the owners as Elias Thorne and Ishkene, his wife. He stamped it with the official seal of the territory, the ink a dark, permanent mark. He was the neutral verifier, the man who made their private agreement into public fact. As he handed the documents to Elias, he lowered his voice. "Croft won't like this, but it's legal and binding. He'll have a hell of a time fighting a family homestead claim. Good luck to you, Thorne." They walked out into the cold sunlight, the papers tucked safely in Elias's coat. They were husband and wife. It was a strange, unsettling thought. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. They were bound together now, not by a dead man's request, but by a legal document and a shared threat. Croft returned 2 weeks later. This time, he brought the sheriff with him. The sheriff was a young man named Miller, who looked uncomfortable and out of his depth. He clearly did not want to be here. Croft, on the other hand, looked triumphant. "Thorne," Croft called out from his horse, "I have an order of eviction signed by the circuit judge. The court has recognized my claim to this land. The sheriff is here to see you vacate the premises peacefully." Elias stepped out onto the porch. Ishkene was right behind him. He held the new deed in his hand. "Sheriff," Elias said, ignoring Croft and speaking directly to the lawman, "there must be some mistake. This is my home." "I'm sorry, Thorne," the sheriff said, his eyes avoiding Elias's. "The judge's order is based on the official survey map held by the territory." "The judge may have been looking at an old map," Elias said calmly, "and he may not have been aware of all the facts. This is not just my claim. It is a family homestead. My wife and I own this land together." He held out the deed. The sheriff took it, his eyes widening slightly as he saw the clerk's signature and the official seal. He read the names: Elias Thorne and Ishkene. He looked at Ishkene, standing proud and resolute on the porch, and then back at the paper. "This document was filed 2 weeks ago," the sheriff said, a new note of authority in his voice. He turned to Croft. "This changes things, Mr. Croft. An eviction order against a single claimant is one thing, but this is a registered family homestead. The law is very specific about that. I can't enforce this order." Croft's face went purple with rage. What do you mean you can't enforce it? It's a court order. Are you refusing to do your duty, Sheriff? My duty is to uphold the law, Sheriff Miller said, his backbone stiffening now that he was on solid legal ground. And the law says this deed supersedes your claim until a full hearing can be held, which could take a year or more. You're trying to evict a man and his wife from their home, Mr. Croft. The judge won't look kindly on that, especially when he sees this. He held up the deed. My advice to you is to take this matter back to your lawyers. As for today, there's nothing more for me to do here. He handed the deed back to Elias, tipped his hat respectfully to Ishkene, and turned his horse. Good day, Thorn. Croft sat on his horse, sputtering, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. He had been beaten, not by guns, but by a piece of paper. Not by a lone, grieving man, but by a family. He glared at Elias and Ishkene, his eyes filled with venom. But he was powerless. He yanked on his horse's reins and galloped down the trail, his defeat a cloud of dust behind him. They both knew he wouldn't be back. The fight was over. Elias and Ishkene stood on the porch, watching until he was gone. The quiet that settled over the valley was deep and peaceful. Elias looked at the deed in his hand, at the two names written there, side by side. A legal wall, a partnership. He looked at Ishkene. She was watching the distant ridge where Croft had disappeared, her expression unreadable, but for the faint easing of the tension in her shoulders. Thank you, he said. The words were not enough, but they were all he had. She turned to him. We defended our home, she said. Not your home, our home. And in that single word, the marriage of convenience became something real. The winter slowly gave way to spring. The snow receded, and the creek began to run full and loud. The world turned from white to green. The change outside was mirrored by a change inside the cabin. It was no longer a place of silent waiting. It was a place of shared work and quiet growth. They planted a garden together in the rich soil by the creek. He turned the earth, and she planted seeds he had never seen before from a small leather pouch she had carried with her. She taught him the names for the squash and beans and corn in her language. He taught her how to graft a branch from a wild apple tree onto a sapling, a skill his father had taught him. They worked in a comfortable rhythm, their movements anticipating each other's, a conversation carried on through gestures and shared tasks. He added a room onto the cabin, for her, a space of her own. He built it with the same care he had used on the rest of the house, but this time he wasn't building for a ghost. He was building for the living, breathing woman who shared his life. When it was finished, she moved her few possessions into it, but more often than not, in the evenings, she still sat in Sarah's chair by the main hearth. One night, he found the courage to speak of it. That was my wife's chair, he said quietly. Sarah's. Ishkene looked at him, her gaze gentle. I know, she said. The ones who are gone are not gone. They make the ground we stand on. She placed a hand on the arm of the chair. This is a good place to remember. He understood then that she was not trying to replace Sarah. She was honoring her. She was acknowledging the foundation of his life, the grief that had shaped him. And by doing so, she was making a space for herself alongside it, not on top of it. The fortress had become a home, with room enough for the past and the present. He found himself talking more, telling her stories about his life before, about his time as a scout with K.O. He told her about Sarah, about her laugh, about the way she had loved the mountains. And she, in turn, began to share small pieces of her own story. She spoke of her people, of the long walk that had brought her here, of the losses she had endured. They were two people who had been hollowed out by grief, and now, slowly, they were beginning to fill the empty spaces in each other's lives. One evening, they were sitting on the porch, watching the last light leave the high peaks. The air was cool and smelled of pine and damp earth. It had been a year since she had arrived, a full circle of seasons. He looked at his hands, resting on his knees. On the back of his right hand was a long, pale scar, a reminder of a rock slide years ago, when he and K.O. had been pinned down in a narrow canyon. He had almost lost the hand. He glanced at her. She was watching the sky, her profile serene, and on her forearm, just visible below the sleeve of her tunic, was a matching scar, thin and white against her brown skin. He had never asked. He had never spoken of it. But he remembered now. She had been there. A young girl, part of the small band of Chiricahua they had been guiding through the pass. He and K.O. had worked for hours to free her and the others from the rockfall. He had held a falling boulder back with his own hands while K.O. pulled her clear. The rock had sliced them both. He looked from his scar to hers. They were a matched set, a mark from a shared past he hadn't even realized they possessed. K.O. had known. Of course he had known. He hadn't just sent a stranger to Elias, he had sent someone who was already tied to him by a moment of violence and rescue, a debt of flesh and bone. The second reason, the hidden meaning of the map, was not just about building a home. It was about recognizing a bond that already existed. She turned her head and saw him looking at the scars. A flicker of understanding passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of that day in the canyon. She did not need to speak. He did not need to ask. The past was simply there, another part of the ground they stood on. He thought of the refrain K.O. had been so fond of. A debt can be paid, but a life must be lived. He had thought the debt was his to K.O., but maybe the debt was something life itself offered you, a chance to mend, a chance to rebuild. It wasn't something you paid back. It was something you lived into. You honored the debt by living a full life, not a narrow one. He looked out at the valley, at their garden, at the creek that remembered the way home. He looked at the woman beside him, his wife, his partner. He thought of that first night, the blizzard, the knock at the door, the simple choice to let the storm in. It had been the single most important decision of his life. He had opened the door to a stranger, and in doing so, he had opened the door to himself, letting the world and all its possibility back in. The quiet was no longer the sound of emptiness. It was the sound of peace.